Is this on?
Welcome, John.
Hello, fellow game devs.
You know the drill, you know the question I'm going to ask. What's your favorite game?
My favorite game of all time is a very difficult choice. It could be World of Warcraft. It could be Ghost Recon. Chrono Trigger was a favorite of mine a long time ago. Yeah, one of those games.
Cool.
I love Minecraft too. Anyway, play all kinds of games.
Great.
There's a lot to choose from. So,
yeah,
the stage is yours.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Entertainment time, everybody. How many of you have played Quake? All right. And how many of you know how Quake was made? Yeah, this will be perfect. All right. So everything in this talk is accurate. I'm going to talk about the development of Quake 1. So Quake was released in 1996, but its story begins in 1990. We used to play D&D, and in John Carmack's campaign, there was this group that was called the Silver Shadow Band that did work for another group that's bigger called Justice. In the Silver Shadow Band was this badass character named Quake that had this incredible Thor-like hammer. He's someone you would almost never see in the campaign because he's so high level, and our group is composed of mainly low-level peons. And we were basically lucky to even see him in this campaign and go on an adventure or two with him. But needless to say, we really wanted to make a game with Quake in it, especially if we could just play as Quake. So we were finishing up our first Commander Keen trilogy in December of 1990, and we decided we're going to make Quake next. So in the preview section of the Commander Keen game, Marooned on Mars, it was the shareware version, we hyped up the idea for our next game, Quake, the Fight for Justice. So we worked on the prototype for a couple weeks in January of 1991, and it just was not going to turn out as well as we hoped. The tech was just not there. We had a side-scrolling engine, but that was about it. We decided to just put it on ice. Someday we will make Quake. And it kind of reminds me of the start of Pixar, how all the ideas for all of their movies up to WALL-E came out during one company meeting at the beginning of the company. And our D&D sessions were basically generating the designs for our future games it did. So we continued working on Dangerous Dave in the Haunted Mansion. Anyone play that? Some people, okay. We're going to return to Quake later. So in the meantime, we released Wolfenstein 3D, which some of you have played that. Spear of Destiny, prequel to Wolfenstein, and Doom, and Doom 2, and Heretic. So there were a lot of games between Keen and Quake. But at this point, Carmack was planning on making his next engine true 3D, thank God. So we decided it was time for Quake. It was only 4 years after the prototype that we worked on, but in that time we had made 15 games and an engine upgrade to Wolf 3D that Raven Software licensed for a game that they made called Shadowcaster. So we dabbled in Atari Lynx development for Wolf 3D. We actually made a version that ran on the Lynx. Atari even asked us at the time to create a mascot for their company, like Mario and Sonic. We named the character Pounce. And we internally created the Super Nintendo version of Wolfenstein and the Jaguar version of Doom. And this was with a team of only 6 people, the Archvile standing in for Tom Hall. So the original ideas behind Quake were starting to develop at the end of 1994. We didn't have a cohesive vision of the game or how it would play. We didn't immediately assume that it would be a shooter. What we did have was the knowledge that we would be creating a true 3D world for gameplay to take place in. And our game design ideas began with Quake the character. He had a huge, powerful hammer. He could throw that hammer and destroy buildings, at least in the D&D universe. And Quake came from a medieval time period, so we already knew the game would take place in the past, and we talked about how the camera could move. One incredible scene that could have been possible in the game is that you would sneak up behind someone in multiplayer mode. They're standing at the edge of a hill, and you just slam their heads in with a hammer and right in the back of their skull, and then they would tumble down the mountain and see the world just rotating forward. I still haven't seen that in the game yet. We never got that working, but the idea was there just in case we wanted that kind of gameplay. So the first part of starting work on this new engine was establishing the priorities. A client-server architecture was just as important as the engine being true 3D. So there's no faking it like our Doom era tech. This time it was going to be real, and it had to be real fast. And to do that, we're going to be using the FPU for the first time to speed up 3D calculations, since most processors at the time had them built in. So we were developing on Intel Pentium chips around 90 megahertz and with 8 megabytes of RAM. And we're still targeting DOS as the gaming operating system to play it on, and developing the game on Next Step workstations. So before making levels, we needed a level editor that could create, true 3D maps. And before we could write a 3D level editor, we needed to define the structure of the world and how it would be represented. So this was John Carmack's new engine design, and it was going to be based on a primitive that he called brushes. So a brush could be any shape, but in the editor, it would start as a rectangular volume. And special cutting tools would basically shave off edges so we could make slopes. But those tools cut at an infinite distance. So creating interesting shapes required several brushes individually sliced and pieced together. An example of this is the first door that you see when you come down the ramp from the initial slip gate on E1M1. So that level was designed to be a tour de force of the new engine's capabilities and the blueprint for upcoming 3D design in Quake. So this is a high-tech door that has a notch on one side, and the other side has a bump on it, and they fit perfectly together. To create this door, I made 3 pieces on one side and 2 pieces on the other side. And because creating a true 3D editor would be like creating today's Maya or 3D Studio Max from scratch and take a really long time. I don't know why that slide's not showing. The editor I wrote was called Quake Ed, and it had a unique way of making levels. So we went with a very simplistic editor view that showed levels from the top down through the level, and this little side view that showed the brushes that were under a special marker that we placed whenever we wanted to adjust the vertical height of brushes. So we could drag the brushes in the view up and down and see the result in a small 3D rendered view up in the corner. So because of this way of viewing and creating levels, it took more work to make simple things like a ramp. For example, the ramp that you walk down when you come through the first slipgate into E1M1. You may be thinking that this way of editing levels would be incredibly difficult and insane, and you'd be right. For example, for that base door, I drew the door in 2D, just like this. Then I had to rotate it so it was vertical, and I could adjust its thickness. And then I could move it, then I could basically rotate it and move it into place using the side view and the marker. And this process was used for every single brush in every single level. It was extremely labor intensive, but the team was making levels instead of waiting for a huge 3D tool to be created. So here are some sketches I made before starting on the first Quake map for E1M1. The final map basically had that shape, which I call the golden horseshoe. This was used in Doom's first map, Doom 2's first map, Heretic's first map, etc. Basically start here, and you go around in a U shape. At this time, early 1995, a lot was happening. Doom and Doom 2 were out in the world and had changed gaming. Yeah. You can get this poster on my site, by the way. Dealing with that involved an incredible amount of talking to journalists because everyone wanted to know how we did it and who we were. It was important to keep John Carmack coding and away from press, doing interviews, so Jay Wilbur and I handled those duties. John knew that he was going to need some more programming firepower. At this bleeding edge of technology, we could only work with the best. And the first, most obvious person that entered our minds was Michael Abrash. After all, he was the genius that wrote Power Graphics Programming, which is the book that I gave to John Carmack, with all the graphics knowledge in it that he needed to develop our first Commander Keen engine in 1990, the game that showed that the PC was a gaming platform that could compete with consoles. Michael was a programming legend already. He had written for Dr. Dobbs' journal for years, teaching the intricacies of 8086 assembly language, the same way that Roger Wagner taught 6502 assembly in the pages of Soft Talk magazine 10 years earlier. So Michael was a hero programmer, and John needed a hero who could write assembly language fast and great. So John flew to Seattle to convince Michael that Quake's technology would be the first step toward the metaverse that Neil Stephenson described in his book, Snow Crash. This was something that Michael was very interested in doing. And it didn't take too much pushing from John to get Michael to leave Microsoft and move to Texas. So the first half of 1995 was very busy with bringing Abrash into id, my coding of Quake ed to get Sandy Peterson and American McGee learning how to make levels in 3D, and getting Hexen underway with Raven Software, working on the Ultimate Doom product, the first retail version of the original Doom that people could just walk into a store and buy, and me spending time experimenting with true 3D level creation in Quake ed. So there was really a lot going on in 1995. During the first 4 months, the engine was working as a client-server architecture, and we made some test levels so we could just move around in them in multiplayer. Since we hadn't established how we were going to be building models in the game yet, we used a golden sphere 2D sprite for the player. So after a short time of researching methods of making 3D models with animation and hardware that could do it quickly and easily, John decided on a path to reading 3D file formats and UV mapping skin textures. We bought a Silicon Graphics Indigo workstation and alias modeling software. So Kevin Cloud decided he was going to be the guy making all of Quake's 3D models. Adrian would do the textures and everything else that required 2D art. So Kevin made the player model first so we could just stop moving around in spheres. The skin textures were a little tricky because they were limited in total coverage. So Kevin had to model a certain way, like there were no side textures here, for example. American was busy making a ton of small maps for John to render. The engine was going through a lot of changes, mainly the architecture of the renderer for speed's sake. American made around 50 small maps for John, stressing different areas of the renderer. Those were all throwaway maps. At the same time, he was working on actual levels for the game. So rewritten algorithms for caching light map rendered textures meant that Abrash had to rewrite his tightly written assembly loops over and over. By the end of the engine's development, there were 8 major engine render architecture changes that required rewriting in assembly. So let me take this time to also say that Quake's renderer was written before the existence of GPUs. That means that every single pixel on the screen was computed with perspective correct texture mapping and placed on the VGA screen, which had a limit of 256 colors. The screen is a 4:3 ratio because 16 by 9 monitors were super expensive and very few people had them. And Quake was usually run in 320 by 200 pixel mode. And this is an early screenshot of Quake before we even created the status bar for it. Halfway through 1995, we still didn't have a solid game design because the engine just kept going through changes and we had no additional coders who could write gameplay code to test our early ideas. So work progressed on models, textures, levels, and the technology. We knew that whatever we created would be usable in any design idea that we settled on. This is one of the very few 640 by 480 screenshots that I made. Hexen launched on October 30th. Devil's Night, is what it's called, during the huge Dwango Deathmatch 95 event that was held at Microsoft's campus. I was at the office to play Deathmatch over the modem with whoever the winner was of the Doom 95 tournament that took place. And the winner was Dennis Fong, also known as Thresh. The twist was that we had to deathmatch in Hexen, which I had been playing a lot of, and which he played for the first time that night. So work continued for another few weeks until the engine was finally considered done enough to make this game. Now, we would have programmer time dedicated to gameplay programming, and we decided to have a company-wide meeting to determine which direction that we would go in. So the team was burnt out at this time. We were working away trying to make a game without gameplay programming or an idea of how fast the engine would go. The speed of the engine would really help determine the kind of game that we could make. A slower engine would be able to create the game design that we had at the start of the project, and a fast engine could be used for an FPS. So I wanted to experiment with game design and see what we could do with this new full 3D fast engine, and I was not as interested in making another FPS as I was about exploring our possibility space. The half of the team who were burnt out wanted to just slap some FPS guns in it and finish the levels and ship it. The other half were okay with trying to do some design experimentation. At that point, though, if you're working with a team in that state, the only way forward is to do the easiest thing. So we decided that Quake would be an FPS. We would start working in one big room together and get the game done as fast as possible. The engine had taken 18 months. So in January of 1996, I decided that my time at id would be done after shipping Quake. I called Tom Hall, who was my id co-founder who left id halfway through Doom, to see if he would be interested in co-founding a new company after Quake shipped. Tom was working on his latest game, which is called Prey. He designed the original Prey. And he said he would love to start another company. So at this point, we had just taken over the rest of the 6th floor at our at Townies Tower, there in Mesquite, Texas. The offices that we took over were demolished, the walls, everything, and we picked the huge corner space as our war room, we called it. We would use this room to finish Quake. And we all moved our computers and belongings into that room. So around this time, we found out that Nine Inch Nails were big fans of Doom and that they played it on their tour bus after gigs. So we got in touch with Trent Reznor and said that we should get together and see if we could do something, do something together. So we came to our office and we talked about the soundtrack for Quake. We decided that it would be ambient, not songs, like all of our previous games. And in the meantime, Trent got us some really great ambient music that a friend of his made to hold us over while he created Quake's soundtrack. And my first task was basically to redesign the game so it used all of the currently created levels up to that point, we're going to try and get done fast, added some story and some creature design that emphasized the Lovecraftian influence of the environment. I added several enslaved old ones, various keys in different dimensions that you needed to travel to so you could free them, and a little bit more complexity to level progression. And after talking with Keith and Adrian about how many models, animations, and textures that they could do, I had to simplify the design into a game that we could finish quickly, even faster than that. So I took a lot of those keys and characters out of the design and just streamlined it back to simple get key, open door, kill monsters, find secrets, find exit. The stuff that we all knew very well. So it was really nice having new, this new real 3D technology so we could have things like secret doors that open by moving back and then sliding sideways. And we finally had platforms that could follow a path and take the player on a ride. We had water you could swim in, and you heard the surface of the water and the wind blowing outside. We added wind tunnels that could propel the player through the air, and we could even change gravity and let the player float. So we used the special properties of the engine to make the levels more dynamic than Doom. And it resulted in a very scary single-player campaign mode. And so this is January 1996. The mood in the war room was not a happy mood. People didn't really talk to each other much. The atmosphere was kind of oppressive. The room was mostly silent, where in years past we'd share music played on my boombox. We just had to get the game done. So we entered crunch mode, and that means 7 days a week until we ship, at least 10 hours a day. So the plans for Iron Storm lay dormant until after Quake's release. Around the end of February, we got the game ready to test multiplayer mode with a few deathmatch maps. In fact, we decided that we wanted all players to test the game for us. So we called it Q-Test, and it took us about 38 hours nonstop to get it ready. We uploaded it to an FTP site on February 24th, 1996, and we just watched the internet reaction. A couple days later, we called 7 of the most hardcore local Doomers to our office so we could watch them play it. They loved it, and their feedback really did help us refine some movement and level issues that we had. This time after Q-Test was a blur. We were working away every day in crunch mode. We got an offer to sell id Software to our publisher GT Interactive for $100 million. We were so deep in Quake that we said that we can't even think about it right now. Like, we just were not in the right frame of mind, so we just turned them down. So on we continued crunching, making more levels, more monsters, more sounds, checking off the design checkboxes. To keep the game at a reasonable size, we had to impose some limitations. We decided that a level's BSP file could not be bigger than 1.4 megabytes. With this restriction, we couldn't make really huge, long levels. So I remember working on a really cool entrance for E2M6. And after the level was built, it went over 1.4 megabytes. So I just deleted the front of the level and just left it the way it was. It was just no use arguing at this point. We just wanted to get the game done. Eventually, I did release the bigger version of the level to the internet about 10 years afterwards, and I named it E2M10. So we were getting close to finishing the levels, and everyone on the team could feel that the end was near. The crunch was so intense that American was sick for the entire last month of the game's development. We did not see him until even a couple of weeks after the release. Other team members kind of pitched in to help finish his levels so we could just ship the game. And I finished all the sound work, and we finally got the tracks from 9 Inch Nails, and a horrible decision from their record company, which stated that the music could not be in MP3 form. They had to be CD audio tracks, burned on a CD, playable only on a CD player. So this is the reason why none of the music played while most people played the game. They would have to leave the CD in the CD drive all the time. So I don't even remember how he decided which day Quake was ready to go, but it was Saturday, June 22nd, 1996, as I had done for every single id Software game since the beginning. I created the demos that you see in attract mode, and I created the Gold Masters. No one was at the office. The company was basically broken. It took me several hours to get the game in a final state because it was the first game that we had made that had subdirectories in it, and finding a compression that wasn't zip and handled subdirectories was difficult. I settled on the LHA compressor, and it took a while to finally get it to work. I wanted someone else at the office to be there for the upload, so I called my friend Mark Fletcher, who is a really hardcore doomer. And I was on IRC, making sure everyone knew that the upload was imminent. The IRC was exploding, and the channel was splitting constantly due to too many people being on the channel. And then I uploaded quake.zip, and I hung out to hear the fans' reactions, and then Mark and I left. So the next month was a pretty slow one. People were recuperating. American finally came back. I took a 2-week vacation, came back to create the retail Quake Gold Masters for physical distribution. And right after that, on August 6th, John Carmack wanted me out of the company, and I wanted to start Iron Storm with Tom, so everything worked out. And within 6 months, Half of id Software's 13 employees left the company, and Quake had really taken its toll. But of course, that wasn't the end. id Software went on to make the incredible Quake 2 right after that. And I was busy heading up Ion Storm while we worked on 4 games at once, Anachronox, Dominion, Daikatana, and Deus Ex. So we still continue to create games to this day, with the exception of John. He's dedicated to general artificial intelligence. The rest of the original id team is still working in the industry. Kevin is still at id Software. Tom's at Play First in San Francisco, and I'm at Romero Games in Galway, Ireland, where life is great. Thank you, and I'm ready for Q&A.